He demanded I help pay for his luxury car but wouldn't even let me borrow it a daughter's journey from obligation to self-worth. Growing up, my relationship with my dad wasn't just complicated. It was quietly painful in all the ways that don't leave bruises but linger for years. From as early as I can remember, he was more like a cold authority figure than a nurturing parent. I always sensed that his love, if it was there, was buried beneath layers of expectations, disappointment, and emotional unavailability. I was only 6 when my mom walked out, and after that it was just the 2 of us. But even in a house with only 2 people, I felt incredibly alone. My dad filled the silence with structure, rules, routines, responsibilities, but never with warmth. He believed success was the only language worth speaking, and anything less than perfection was failure. When I brought home grades that were decent, he'd say things like, "This is good, but it's not excellent." And when I struggled, he'd either ignore it or remind me that life doesn't make room for weakness. He never asked how I felt or if I needed help. Those conversations didn't exist in our world, so I adapted, shrinking parts of myself to fit into his definition of acceptable. I tried to meet his standards because deep down I wanted him to see me, to be proud of me, to maybe even love me in a way that didn't come with a scorecard. When I turned 20 and moved into my own apartment to be closer to campus, I thought things might shift, that he might see my independence as maturity and connect with me more. But instead, it felt like the distance became an excuse for him to disengage further. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, he bought a car. A sleek, polished SUV that didn't match his lifestyle or his income. I remember the day he pulled into the driveway with it, grinning for the first time in a long time like he'd won the lottery. I was stunned, not just by the car, but by how proud he looked. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a statement. And even though he didn't say it out loud, the message was clear. This was his reward, something he'd gotten for himself because no one else was going to give it to him. I asked him how he could afford it, and he waved me off like it wasn't my business, like I wouldn't understand. I wanted to be happy for him, I really did, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. How could he afford something so extravagant when he'd always complained about bills and money being tight? And if he was willing to make such a big purchase, what did that mean for the rest of our already fragile relationship? After the car arrived, everything about the house seemed to orbit around it, like it had become the prized possession, the center of gravity in his universe. It gleamed in the driveway like some sort of trophy, untouched by dust or fingerprints. He washed it obsessively, spent hours talking about the features to anyone who would listen, and never missed a chance to mention the luxury brand. But the oddest part was how protective he became, almost paranoid. I remember the first time I stood too close while getting out of my rideshare. He snapped at me, "Watch the door. That paint job costs more than your rent." It was humiliating. And then there were the moments when I needed a car the most. Small but important moments, like when I had a job interview across town or needed to grab groceries during a storm and the buses weren't running. I'd muster up the courage to ask if I could borrow it for just a couple of hours, promising to be careful, to fill up the gas, to park far away from other cars. But every single time, his answer was the same cold no. No explanation, no room for compromise. "It's too valuable. You're not experienced enough. I can't risk it." That car became a symbol of everything I wasn't allowed to have: comfort, trust, freedom. I felt like I was being punished for not being successful enough yet, like my struggles didn't matter because I hadn't earned anything shiny to show for them. Meanwhile, I was juggling a part-time job and community college, riding buses that broke down half the time, and trying to plan a future with barely any help. There were nights I'd come home so exhausted I couldn't see straight, and I'd walk past that car with a knot in my stomach, knowing he'd rather let it sit there unused than let me get any benefit from it. I'd wonder what kind of person prioritizes leather seats over their own child's safety and progress. But still, part of me kept hoping that one day he'd see how hard I was working and decide I'd finally earned it, earned some sliver of support or trust. That day never came. The car just sat there, a monument to his pride and my exclusion. And the worst part wasn't just the rejection. It was how routine it became. I started to expect the no before I even asked. Started walking to job interviews in the rain without bothering to knock on his door. It was easier to deal with silence than to hear, yet again, that I wasn't good enough to touch something he cared about. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those gray, forgettable days where the sky feels heavy and time drags a little slower, when he first brought up money. I had come over to pick up some mail that still came to his address, and he was standing in the kitchen pouring himself a glass of iced tea like everything was normal. We exchanged the usual small talk, brief, shallow, tension bubbling just under the surface as always, when he sighed and casually dropped, "Man, these car payments are killing me." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. I assumed he just needed to vent or wanted to justify why he was cutting back on groceries or something. But then, he turned to me and asked, "You think you could help me out a little, just until I catch up?" I thought I misheard him. I blinked a few times, hoping I was imagining it. I wasn't. He looked serious, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to ask his barely scraping by daughter to chip in on a luxury car she wasn't even allowed to drive. My first instinct was to laugh, not because it was funny, but because of the absurdity. I mean, was he joking? Here I was, trying to juggle tuition payments, rising rent, and inconsistent shifts at work, barely getting enough sleep, and he wanted me to dip into the nothing I had to help him make payments on a car I'd never even sat in. I managed to ask carefully, "Why would I help pay for something I don't get to use?" And immediately regretted it, not because I didn't mean it, but because of how fast his expression shifted. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, and I could feel the air change. He looked at me like I'd just slapped him. "Because I'm your father," he said sharply, "and family helps family." That phrase again, used like a weapon, something he only pulled out when it served him. I wanted to scream, to remind him of all the times I needed help and got nothing, of how often I asked for emotional support or practical assistance and was met with a cold wall of indifference. I wanted to list every time I cried in my room as a kid because he didn't show up to school events or forgot my birthday. But instead I just stood there, dumbfounded, holding my mail like a shield. I told him the truth. I couldn't help. I said it wasn't personal, but it was. I just couldn't keep bending over backward for someone who'd never once bent for me. His response was silence. Then he scoffed and turned his back, muttering something under his breath about kids these days and no respect. I left feeling smaller than ever, carrying the weight of guilt he'd managed to hand me without even touching me. That ride home felt longer than usual, like I was carrying the full history of our broken relationship in my backpack. In the days that followed our conversation, something shifted, not just in him, but in the atmosphere between us. His calls stopped. The occasional check-in texts dried up. Even the bare minimum interactions we used to have, like him forwarding my mail or updating me on the dog's vet visits, vanished. At first, I tried to convince myself that maybe he was just busy or preoccupied with work or bills, but deep down I knew exactly what was happening. He was punishing me, not with words or outright aggression, but with silence, distance, and that invisible coldness that only he knew how to wield so well. I thought I would feel angry or bitter, but instead I felt hollow. It's a strange kind of pain to realize that your worth in someone's eyes is tied to your usefulness. That love, in their world, is transactional. And apparently because I wouldn't help cover payments on a car I never benefited from, I'd failed some unspoken test of loyalty. I started replaying our conversation in my head over and over, wondering if I'd said something wrong, if maybe I had been too blunt or selfish. I mean, it's hard not to internalize that kind of reaction when it's coming from someone who's supposed to protect and nurture you. But every time I tried to imagine the scenario reversed, me asking him for financial help for school or rent, it was laughable. I already knew what his answer would have been. He would have scoffed, told me I needed to learn to stand on my own 2 feet, maybe even reminded me that he had it tougher at my age. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who preached independence and resilience suddenly wanted financial help from the daughter he'd emotionally neglected for years. I talked to a couple of close friends about it. half expecting them to tell me I was overreacting, that maybe I should give him the money to keep the peace. But instead they were furious on my behalf. "He has some nerve," one said. "He's treating you like a bank, not a daughter." And hearing it from someone else made it hit harder. It wasn't just me being sensitive or selfish. It was a pattern, one where I was always the giver, always the one trying to earn love or approval that should have been unconditional. Still, I couldn't help but miss him. Or rather, miss the idea of having a father who cared. Even when the relationship was strained, there was comfort in routine, knowing that at least he was there, even if distant. Now, the silence echoed louder than any argument we could have had. I kept checking my phone out of habit, waiting for a text that wouldn't come, and every time I passed by a car that looked like his on the street, my stomach would twist, a mix of anger, sadness, and disappointment churning inside me. I didn't want his money or his car. I just wanted to be treated like I mattered. The silence between us stretched on for weeks, and every day it became heavier to carry. I tried to focus on my classes, my job, and the little bits of life I was piecing together, but his absence felt louder than any noise. I'd sit in the campus library staring at my laptop screen, pretending to study while my mind wandered to questions I couldn't answer. Did he really care about me? Or was I just another obligation he couldn't wait to pass off? The guilt played with my head, especially during moments of quiet when I couldn't distract myself. I started thinking maybe I should have just helped, even if it was unfair. Maybe then he wouldn't be avoiding me, wouldn't be giving me the cold shoulder like I'd betrayed him. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the solution. Giving in might have bought temporary peace, but it would have confirmed the toxic pattern, that he could ignore my needs, refuse to help me, and still expect me to serve his. I had to remind myself of the countless times I'd needed him, when I couldn't afford new books for school, when my heating went out last winter, when I called crying after a terrible breakup, and he either brushed me off or changed the subject. There was no family helps family back then. That phrase only showed up when he needed something, like a magic guilt wand to wave over me. And yet, despite all the resentment building in my chest, I couldn't shut off the part of me that still craved a relationship with him. I wanted a father, not a financier, not a lecturer, not a walking list of criticisms. I wanted someone who asked how my day went, who checked in on my goals, who remembered my favorite coffee or showed up when I gave a class presentation. It was hard to admit how badly I wanted that, because admitting it meant accepting the hole it left in me. I started journaling more, trying to unpack the tangle of emotions. Sometimes I wrote letters to him that I never planned to send, just raw, unfiltered thoughts. In one of them I wrote, "I wish you saw me as more than a burden or a bank account. I wish you loved me in a way that didn't depend on how useful I was to you." Writing it down helped, even if it didn't change anything. At least it was honest. Around that time, I also started talking to a campus counselor. At first, I felt weird about it, like I was overreacting or wasting her time. But she listened. She didn't judge. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not as someone's disappointment, but as a person with valid feelings. It was a small step, but it reminded me that I didn't need to carry the weight of my father's choices alone. As weeks turned into over a month of silence, I started to notice something odd happening. Not from him, but from within myself. The ache I'd felt every time my phone stayed quiet began to dull. Not because I didn't care anymore, but because I was growing tired of carrying pain that wasn't mine to begin with. I had spent most of my life twisting myself into emotional knots, trying to earn scraps of attention or validation from someone who rarely offered it freely, and suddenly I just stopped. Not completely, not overnight, but enough to start feeling a strange sense of peace creeping in around the edges. I still had moments when I'd see his name in my contacts and feel the urge to text something, anything, to reopen the line between us. But I didn't. Instead, I poured that energy into things that brought me calm. I started biking in the mornings, watching the sun rise over the edge of campus as I cleared my head. I picked up extra shifts at work, not for the money, but because staying busy kept the sadness at bay. I even started reconnecting with people I'd pulled away from when things got too heavy at home. Old classmates, neighbors, even a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. These people didn't want anything from me except my time and presence. No expectations, no emotional debts. And that contrast made me see my relationship with my dad for what it really was: conditional love dressed up as duty. I also started seeing the car, the one that had sparked all this turmoil, in a different light. Before, it had felt like a slap in the face, a shiny reminder of how little I mattered to him compared to his ego or image. But now, it looked more like a mask, something he hid behind to feel important. Maybe he didn't buy it just to show off, but to convince himself he was successful, in control, powerful. And maybe asking me for money wasn't just about the payments, it was about dragging me into his illusion, making me part of a narrative where he was still the provider, the authority, the one in charge. But I wasn't a child anymore, and I didn't owe him the comfort of pretending. I had my own bills, my own future to build, and no room left to subsidize someone else's denial. That realization didn't make the pain disappear, but it gave it shape. It wasn't just about the car or the money, it was about a lifetime of emotional debt I'd been expected to pay, without ever receiving a single deposit in return. And once I saw it that way, I couldn't unsee it. I knew then that reconnecting with him might happen someday, but not if it meant sacrificing my self-respect. Not if it meant silencing the part of me that had finally found her voice. It was around that time, when I was finally starting to breathe without feeling like I owed someone every inhale, that he reached out again. Out of the blue, a simple text: "Hope you're doing well. Can we talk?" I stared at my phone for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen, unsure if I should even respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to protect the fragile progress I'd made, but curiosity and years of habit won out. I replied, keeping it neutral, and we arranged to meet at a small diner halfway between our homes. I walked in early, palms sweaty, stomach turning. When he arrived, he looked tired, not just physically, but like someone carrying the weight of something unspoken. We made small talk for a bit, danced around the real reason we were there, until he finally leaned back and said, "I've been thinking about our last conversation." His voice was quieter than usual, lacking that familiar edge. He didn't apologize outright. My dad was never one for clear admissions. But he said things like, "Maybe I asked too much," and "I didn't mean to make you feel like you weren't appreciated." It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd ever gotten before. I listened carefully, not ready to forgive, but open to understanding. I told him how his request made me feel, like I was being used, like my worth was tied to my wallet instead of who I am. I told him that growing up, I always felt like I had to prove myself, like love was something I had to earn with perfect grades or self-sacrifice. He didn't interrupt, didn't get defensive, which surprised me. He just nodded slowly, sipping his coffee like each word I said was heavier than the last. He told me the car was a stupid decision, that he bought it during a moment of ego and panic, wanting something that made him feel like he hadn't failed at life. That hit me, because for the first time I saw him not as the larger-than-life, impossible-to-please man I grew up with, but as someone deeply insecure, desperate for control and validation in a world that kept moving too fast for him. That didn't excuse everything, but it explained a lot. We talked for nearly 2 hours, and while nothing was magically fixed, the conversation was real. It felt like peeling back layers of years we'd never unpacked. When we stood to leave, he didn't hug me, but he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I'll try to do better." And even though I didn't know if he would, that moment mattered. It didn't erase the past, but it gave me hope that maybe the future didn't have to look the same. Maybe we could learn to see each other not as disappointments or obligations, but as flawed people trying our best in the only ways we knew how. After that conversation at the diner, things didn't suddenly become perfect, but they did shift in small, noticeable ways. My dad started checking in more regularly, not in the overbearing way some parents might, but with quiet consistency. A text here, a short call there. He even asked about my classes, something I couldn't remember him doing since I started college. At first, I braced myself, expecting the kindness to come with strings attached, but it didn't. Not immediately, at least. I didn't let my guard down fully, though. Years of emotional letdowns had taught me that healing from someone's inconsistency wasn't about waiting for them to change. It was about learning how to manage your expectations and protect your peace. Still, there was a cautious optimism that followed me around, like the first warm day after a brutal winter. It didn't mean the season had changed, but it hinted that maybe it could. I spent more time focusing on myself, pouring energy into my future instead of past wounds. I started attending workshops on campus about financial literacy and independence, realizing that part of reclaiming my identity meant understanding how to build a stable life without relying on unreliable people. One afternoon, while reviewing my budget and job prospects, I thought about how easy it would have been to give my dad the money just to avoid conflict. But now, standing firmer in who I was, I felt a quiet pride that I hadn't folded. That one decision, saying no, had rippled outward and taught me more about boundaries, self-worth, and resilience than any lecture or book could. At the same time, I noticed something else changing. The resentment I'd held onto for years, the anger that had once felt like armor, began to soften. Not because I forgot what had happened, but because I started accepting that my dad's shortcomings weren't mine to fix. I had spent so much of my life trying to earn love from a version of him that didn't exist, when what I really needed was to love the version of myself I'd been forced to grow into. I still had days where the old pain resurfaced, moments where his voice in my head would echo with judgment or guilt, but they didn't paralyze me like before. Instead, I'd acknowledge them, breathe through them, and remind myself that I was building something better, not just a future, but a foundation rooted in self-respect. And though our relationship was far from perfect, I realized that I no longer needed it to be. I didn't need him to be the father I wished I'd had. I just needed to be the person I was proud to become. And if one day he truly wanted to meet me there, on equal ground, not as someone to control, but as someone to connect with, then maybe, just maybe, there was space for that too. By the time autumn rolled in and the leaves began changing colors around campus, I had settled into a new rhythm, one that didn't center around waiting for approval or fearing disappointment. My dad and I kept in touch, loosely, like two people navigating unfamiliar territory, unsure of the rules but trying not to step on landmines. There were moments when it almost felt normal, like when he texted me out of the blue to ask what kind of coffee I liked because he was at a store and just wondered, or the time he commented on one of my social media posts with something lighthearted, even complimentary. These were the crumbs of connection I used to crave, and now, while I appreciated them, I didn't build my emotional diet around them anymore. I was learning to feed myself, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, without relying on someone who had so often withheld nourishment. At one point, he brought up the car again, this time casually mentioning that he was thinking about trading it in because the payments were getting tight. I didn't offer help. I just listened, nodded, and let the moment pass without taking responsibility for his choices. That too felt like growth. Not long after, I was walking home from class when I passed by a girl arguing on the phone, tears streaming down her face, her voice barely a whisper. "You only call me when you need something," she said, her words slicing through the crisp air. I stopped for a second, heart tightening. It was like hearing my own story in someone else's mouth. I wanted to tell her it gets better, that it's okay to draw a line, that love without respect isn't love at all. But I didn't intrude. I just carried that moment with me, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this struggle, that so many of us were out here trying to unlearn the idea that we exist to fix the people who hurt us. I journaled about it that night, writing, "I'm allowed to be whole, even if he never becomes who I needed." And it felt like truth. I think what surprised me most in all this was how letting go didn't always mean cutting off. It meant detaching from the hope that one day he'd become the father I dreamed of, and instead accepting who he was and choosing how much space he was allowed to take up in my life. It was liberating in a quiet, powerful way, I could still care about him, even love him, without letting his needs consume me. I could forgive, not to excuse the past, but to free myself from carrying it like a stone in my chest. That clarity didn't come all at once, but in moments like these, in silence, in reflection, in watching someone else's pain and realizing how far I'd come. I wasn't healed yet, maybe never fully would be, but I was healing. And for now, that was enough. Winter crept in slowly, frosting the windows of my apartment and layering the world in white, and with it came a strange stillness, a kind of quiet that felt earned rather than empty. I found myself reflecting more often, not just on what had happened with my dad, but on everything that had led to where I was now. It's wild how pain can reshape you, not just in the obvious, scarred ways, but in the soft strength it carves beneath the surface. I had always seen myself as the girl who had to carry things alone, the one who stepped up when no one else did, who smiled even when she was breaking. But now, I was learning to be something more. Someone who didn't just survive, but chose what she allowed into her life. My relationship with my dad remained complex. We weren't estranged, but we weren't close either. We existed in a middle space, sharing occasional updates, shallow conversations, sometimes even warm ones. But there was no illusion anymore. I no longer saw him as a man who owed me something, nor did I owe him my peace. He was simply a person, flawed like everyone else, who made his choices, and I made mine. And one of the most powerful choices I made was to stop expecting him to fill a role he was never capable of inhabiting. I gave that responsibility back to the universe, to time, to the version of myself that had learned to parent her own wounds. That freedom opened up new space in my heart, space I filled with better friendships, quiet joys, late-night talks with people who saw me without judgment, and long walks where I didn't need to rush anywhere. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something that belonged to me, not a replica of someone else's expectations, but a life that reflected who I was becoming. I thought about the younger version of me often, the one who just wanted to be seen, to be loved for who she was, not what she could do for others. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her that it's okay to walk away from people who only show up when they need something. That love without respect is just emotional debt. And that healing doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like standing in your own light without asking permission. I don't know what the future holds for me and my dad. Maybe one day we'll find a way to truly connect, maybe not. But either way, I've made peace with it, because I'm no longer that girl begging for access to something I already deserved. I'm the woman who said no, not out of spite, but out of self-love. And in that one word, I discovered a version of myself who no longer waits for someone else's approval to feel whole. I didn't just survive my father's entitlement. I outgrew it.